we knew that one of the things that's going to really sell the HUD was having eye reflections. The camera is so close up. He's a 4K plate. Most of the textures are 4K plates. We had to work at this extremely large resolution, and so we knew we were going to be able to see that kind of detail. So what we did is we had one scene that had all of the elements, and this is the scene. This is the scene where we could animate all the individual elements, so we could see how they related to each other. But also, what we did is we created these two little cameras. There's one camera, and there's another camera, and so these cameras kind of floated out in front of him. And then we created some eyeball geometry. Remember how I said that we had to match-mate the eyeballs so we knew exactly where he was looking and where they were? What we did is we put the cameras straight up right inside of the eyeballs. I know this looks a little funny. It looks like his eyeballs are kind of popping out of his head. But remember, his face would have volume. So that's where his eyes were in the plate when we match-mated them. So we really, for each shot that we did, we had to render all of the elements for the shot camera, but we also had to render all of them for the left eye, all of them for the right eye, because sometimes there were things that were only show up in one eye in the eye reflections. Then so each one of these cameras was recording the entire scene and then projecting it back onto the eyeballs, and then the shot camera was recording the results of that, which you can see here, and you can see they're really different, and there's enough resolution there, actually just proxy res, that you can actually recognize them. So we rendered, so both of those eyes render the whole scene twice, and then they get composited on the eyes with some roto, and then the shot camera records the whole thing, including the eye reflections, and composites that together in the final shot. So it was this like massive amount of rendering.
Well, and I think that's one of the interesting things, and coming from a flame background like myself, I'm used to the 3D compositing environment of action, whereas, say, maybe shake artists aren't actually used to approaching a problem in this way. When you have these 3D tools, it really opens up a lot of creative ways to do these things correctly, in essence.
Right, yeah. This is like true eye reflections, you know? It also opens up a hell of a lot of rendering time. I mean, the first time we rendered this project, and remember there's a lot of motion blur and like big, huge elements right in front of the camera. It was rendering at about 40 hours per frame, and we thought, my God, we've got 2 weeks left, there's no way, we're screwed. And so we started optimizing, and actually, I can show you one more thing if there's time. One of the ways that we were able to optimize is, motion blur is a huge expensive thing, and time blur. So there's vector blur, which does kind of a 2D style blur, great for 2D animation. But for Z-space stuff, you really need time blur. Unfortunately, time blur just renders the same frame 16, 30, 60 times, depending on how much you need to get the proper smooth motion blur. So not only are we rendering the scene 3 times for the eye reflections in the camera, but then rendering each and every element 30 times more. It would have been impossible actually to render. So down here, right here, I can make this real big for you. So here we have the scanline render, and this is for a particular element, and this is what we called the bubble, which shows the horizon, right? So so we have the scanline render, which is the 2D output. And you can see we have kind of like a trifurcated path here. One goes to vector blur, one goes down to the switch, just pipes straight through, and another goes to time blur. Because basically what we realized was we could, the HUD stuff is moving around a lot, but they're not moving like this all that often. And actually we could get away with motion blurring with vector blur, kind of a 2D style, most of the time, and then when it was really moving around in Z, that's when we had to go to time blur. So we were kind of scratching our heads thinking, if only there was a way that we could kind of keyframe when it should be vector and when it should be time blur. So what we did is we created this little switch, and we put an expression there. And I can show you a really simple version of the expression, but actually I can just describe it. Basically what it did is, in a complicated way, what it had to do, because we had these spheres that were kind of growing in, to make it look like it was moving in Z, we actually had scaling going on, right? So we couldn't just look at the X, Y, and if it was moving in Z. We had to think about the camera and the angle to the widget and whether it was moving in a 2D relative to the camera or if it was moving 3D. Because sometimes moving in a 2D relative to the widget was actually moving, 3D relative to the camera. So we had it figure that out, and then basically it would just we had some threshold where it would kick over to time blur if it really needed it, or kick back to vector blur, and our renders went from 40 hours to around 2.5 minutes. In the end, after that, with some other optimizing as well. So this is the expressions and simple switches like this are the way that you can build some. Actually, it's almost like intelligence, because otherwise, as a compositor, there's no way that we could have our compositors go in and flip little switches. It'd almost be easier to render it out with motion blur.
Well, and managing that just gets in the way of animating too.
Yeah, right. We wanted them to focus on get this shot to tell the story, because that's what Jon Favreau, he was on us for make it tell the story. There's some really important story points, and he told us what they all were, and then he was really open to collaborating with us with us on exactly how we did it. But by having these tools, we could have the comper, and also because the comper, really they were like a TD and a rigger and an animator as well. They could really just focus, because they were taking the shot from beginning to completion. They could really just get into the story and into the creative treatment of the shot, and really go with it without having to worry about how to make these things animate in time with the plate and all that stuff. We automated a lot of it.
Oh, cool. Very interesting. Well, thanks for taking the time to show us that.
Oh, my pleasure, yeah.